Why did all types of ancient people die out except Homo sapiens? According to the laws of the evolutionary development of living nature, competition is usually won by a more adapted and stronger species. We are now the only human species on the planet, but at the dawn of their appearance, our distant ancestors had to withstand serious competition with other contenders for the title of King of Nature. In this video, we'll talk about who else lived and developed in parallel with our species and why the Cro-Magnons turned out to be stronger and more successful. If you like the videos that are released on the Dinosaur Age channel, then you can help promote them. To show our videos to many viewers as possible, you just need to like the videos that you like. We encourage our viewers to actively subscribe to the channel and share their opinion in the comments. If natural disasters and other factors do not come into play, then those animals and plants quickly adapt with their change in living conditions and develop adaptations that are absent from the opponent should they win in the struggle for survival. The main weapon of our distant ancestors turned out to be a more developed intellect and a high level of socialization. Also, our development was strongly affected by the constant change in conditions in the course of settling around the planet. All kinds of people who could compete with the Cro-Magnons appeared on Earth long before them. And by the time a new kind of people came into their territory, they had a serious head start in preparing for the struggle for a place under the sun. They had already adapted to climate conditions, developed their own survival strategy, learned how to use and make various necessary tools. It is believed that thanks to their developed brains, the Cro-Magnons quickly adopted and improved the necessary skills from the indigenous inhabitants. And then they were simply forced out to move to severe habitats. Moreover, this displacement did not take place in the form of an armed clash. Just because of its sociality and mass character, the Cro-Magnon society quickly developed territories and resources, and the locals were forced to be content with the remnants or move to a new place. At different times and in different parts of the planet, simultaneously with representatives of the species Homo sapiens, from 5 to 8 other types of people lived on Earth. Different groups of scientists classify these species in different ways, sometimes separating them, sometimes combining them into common groups. All these species had a common ancestor, but at some point, the branches of their development were divided. Also, scientists cannot always accurately indicate the time of residence of these related species. So, it's not at all a fact that they died out with the help of our distant ancestors. According to the various estimates, the Cro-Magnons appeared on the territory of the African continent from 100 to 200,000 years ago. And about 50,000 years ago, they left Africa and began their settlement around the world. And after 30,000 years, not a single parallel developing human species remained on Earth. All of them were either exterminated or driven back by the new masters of the planet to uninhabitable regions. Perhaps some of them were simply assimilated into the Cro-Magnon society. Evidence for this theory can be found in the presence of genes from other species in modern humans. Although some scientists believe that we inherited these genes from common ancestors, different types of people could not interbreed among themselves. Cro-Magnons lived in groups of up to 100 people. They knew how to build dwellings from skins or equipped dugouts. They could also live in caves. They dressed in skins. But one of the most important qualities of this kind of people was the ability to articulate and fully communicate with each other. This skill helped them hunt more organized. Therefore, the Cro-Magnons could jointly produce such a large prey as deer, mammoths, and other large mammals. In addition, these primitive people mastered the manufacturing of huge number of various useful devices and tools. A spear thrower helped them hunt better. A device capable of throwing a spear more than 100 to 120 meters. With the help of snares, it was possible to catch small animals and birds. And as for catching fish, harpoons and hooks were invented. An important addition to all of this was the domestication of domestic animals. Scientists say that around this time, the dog was domesticated by man. Findings related to the cultural life of the Cro-Magnons also speak of a high level of development. They left us a lot of art objects, drawing on the walls, decorations, and even children's toys. Scientists also talk about the rather complex funeral rites of our ancestors. All this means that primitive people could devote enough time to activities not related to the extraction of food and survival. What other types of people could oppose to this mass character and organization? Homo naledi. Until recently, it was believed that the remains of one of the dead-end branches of mankind discovered in South Africa belonged to later eras, and these creatures died out long before the appearance of the first Homo sapiens. But recent studies have shown that these remains are only 200 to 300,000 years old. So these primitive people could theoretically meet with the first representatives of our species. Unfortunately, apart from the bones and skulls of Homo naledi, scientists have not found any other finds. In the cave where they rested, there are no traces of any tools, clothing, or other organic matter. Most likely, these creatures were closer to the Australopithecus. Their hands were adapted for moving through trees, and the structure of their legs made it possible to make long transitions and run well. Heidelberg-Man. It is believed that this species could be the link from which the separations of sapiens and Neanderthals began. Heidelberg-Man outwardly looked like modern people, but the size of his brain was much smaller and inferior to ours, and his height could reach 175 centimeters. Distinctive features of the Heidelberg-Man were a massive brow ridge and the absence of chin protrusion, a thick-walled skull, and a low forehead. Moreover, his dental arch practically did not differ from ours. According to various sources, this type of people originated in Africa from 800 to 500,000 years ago, and then also settled throughout Eurasia. It is believed that the African and European branches of the Heidelberg people were isolated from each other for a long time and developed independently. The last finds of the remains of this species date back to around 130,000 years ago. This means that at the dawn of their existence, they could well have interacted with our ancestors. Despite his outward appearance, the Heidelberg-Man was distinguished by his great ingenuity. Representatives of this species definitely knew how to use fire and make primitive tools. There is evidence that it was they who first began to use stone tips. Perhaps they knew of art and took care of the old and infirmed fellow tribesmen. They lived in groups of up to several dozen people and hunted together on large creatures. Floresian man and Javanthropus. In the process of settling the prehistoric ancestors of mankind, some groups of different anthropoid creatures found themselves in forced isolation on the islands. A striking representative of such a population are the inhabitants of the island of Java, who inhabited it about 100,000 years ago. In the process of their evolution, they acquired some unique features that made them a separate kind of people. But, like all closed populations, the Javanthropes were doomed to slow degradation and extinction. Most likely, given the abundance of food and the absence of dangers, they could not resist new predators or competitors that appeared on the island. The same fate befell the inhabitants of the island of Flores. Their degeneration was expressed in a decrease in the size of the body and brain. They appeared on this island about 1 million years ago and died out only about 50,000 years ago. But over the past 450,000 years of their existence, their brain had decreased by more than 2 times. Some researchers believe that their cause of their death could be a major eruption of a local volcano. It is also quite possible that for the last hobbits from Flores were destroyed by representatives of the Homo sapiens, who at the time inhabited the island of the Pacific Ocean, heading towards the Australian continent. Denisovan. This species was discovered quite recently. and the Denisov cave in Altai gave it its name. Now, it is believed that they lived through East Asia, but there is practically no data on their life and skills. It is only known that they had dark skin, dark hair, and large teeth. There is evidence that they could have had common offspring with Neanderthals. Denisovan genes have also been found in the DNA of modern humans. Therefore, it is quite possible that the Denisovans were assimilated by another species. Neanderthals. The confrontation between these relatives and ours and the ancient Cro-Magnons is written not only in school textbooks. A lot of believable and not very artistic films have been shot about this topic. It can be reliably said that Neanderthals, before the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe, survived quite normally in these harsh places. They knew how to sew clothes from skin, made devices for hunting and everyday life, mastered the arts, and possessed the rudiments of religion. It is very likely that the more intellectually developed Cro-Magnons, whose tribes were larger, simply forced the Neanderthals to look for new places to live. It is also possible that a general cooling of the climate began at this time, and they simply could not cope with the changes that had occurred. Among the finds of the remains of this species, about 90% of the bones belonged to children. Most likely, this species simply died out due to hunger and deprivation. But our distant ancestors also played a role in this extinction. In our past issues, we have repeatedly mentioned other species of people who lived on Earth at different times. Some of them are our distant ancestors. Others turned out to be dead-end branches of evolution. All of them except our species are currently extinct. But sometimes the evolution of humanity took rather bizarre forms. And today, we will tell you in more detail about the most unusual types of prehistoric people. Subscribe to the Age of Dinosaurs channel. This will allow you to be the first one to know about the release of new videos dedicated to the evolution of life on the planet. And with the help of likes and comments from the viewers, these videos can be watched by the maximum number of science lovers. Also, the activity from our viewers will allow the channel creators to assess the interest of the audience. Homo habilis. Until recently, Homo habilis, or Homo habilis, was considered the first hominid who could make a primitive tool. Also, most likely, it was the habilis who became the first people to switch to omnivory. Our earlier ancestors preferred a vegetarian diet. Homo habilis was first described in 1964. He lived in Kenya, South Africa, and Tanzania from 2.3 to 1.5 million years ago. In a number of external characteristics, habilis was very similar to gray seal, that is, less massive australopithecines. But their structure also contains features characteristics of later hominids. Their skull had a more rounded vault and a larger brain cavity than all known Australopithecus species. Their brain volume is estimated at approximately 650 grams. They also lack the neutral crests found in Australopithecines. The face of the Homo habilis is no longer so flattened. The nasal cavity is pushed forward, and the cheekbones, on the contrary, are moved back. The jaws are smaller than those of the Australopithecines. Homo habilis' teeth are smaller than those of its ancestors, but larger than those of its descendants. This clearly illustrates the tendency towards a gradual decrease in their size during the evolution of hominids. With more graceful body sizes, the proportions of the habilis limbs were the same as those of the Australopithecus. Their teeth were almost flat, without pronounced arches. The toes were short, and the thumbs were completely aligned with the rest. The height of a skilled man was no more than 120 centimeters. He weighed around 40 to 50 kilograms. It is from the habilis that the beginning of the rapid growth in the size of the brain of our ancestors can be traced. They were the first to use stone tools, which is how they got their name. Homo habilis is the creator of the early pebble culture. It is also known as Olduvai or Aldewan culture. The first discoveries of the remains of this primitive man were made in 1960 in the town of Olduvai in Tanzania. The habilis made simple stone knives. Perhaps they used fire and knew how to make primitive clothing. These ancient people ate mainly nuts, other fruits and roots. Their diet also included small animals. Rudolph man. At approximately the same time as Homo habilis, another species of prehistoric people lived in East Africa. His remains were found in Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. Their age ranges from 1.9 to 2.4 million years. Scientists have not yet determined the degree of its relationship to modern people, but this could either be our distant ancestor or a side branch of the evolution of the genus Homo. The first discovery of this extinct species was found in the vicinity of Lake Rudolph in Kenya. It consisted of a single incomplete skull. It was described by the Soviet anthropologist Valery Pavlovich Alexeyev in 1968. He also proposed the first name, Pithecanthropus rufaldensis. Later studies still made it possible to classify these creatures as belonging to the genus Homo. This is how the current name was assigned to it. Outwardly, Homo rudolph was not very different from Homo habilis. These were ape-like creatures with flattened faces, sloping foreheads, and large jaws. The back of their heads were massive and protruded backwards. According to recent estimates, the brain volume of these ancient people was up to 700 cubic centimeters. This is significantly more than that of the Australopithecines that preceded it. Their height could exceed 180 centimeters. These were upright creatures that lived in savannas, semi-deserts, and along the banks of reservoirs. One can only guess about the lifestyle of Rudolph man. At the moment, scientists do not have many fossil remains at their disposal, but it's believed that they lived by hunting and gathering. It is unlikely that they could make any serious tools or weapons. Most likely, Rudolph man improvised objects like stones and sticks for his needs. Homo naledi. In 2013, the scientific community was stirred by a truly unique discovery. Two cavers managed to penetrate the remote Dinaledi Grotto of Rising Star Cave, located near Johannesburg. On the floor of the cave, measuring 1 to 9 meters, almost undisturbed by time, lay the remains of 15 individuals of a previously unknown species of primitive people. After studying the finds of the professional anthropologists, the species was given the name Dinaledi man, or Homo naledi. Among the skeletons found were the remains of both adults and teenagers, as well as children. Due to the distance of the chamber from the entrance to the cave and the difficulty of entering it, no one was able to find this burial earlier. It is believed that the path to this remote grotto was just as difficult during the life of Homo naledi. Therefore, some researchers suggested that they dragged their dead fellow tribesmen there. This behavior may indicate the presence of simple funeral rites. Previously, it was believed that this was characteristic of the culture of later people. Also, some scientists have suggested that the dark marks on the ceiling of the cave are the remains of soot from torches. That is, the inhabitants of the cave could light their way to a remote part. And next to one of the skeletons was a piece of stone that was discovered, which had many traces of processing. But scientists don't yet have an exact answer to these mysteries. Dark spots on the walls, depressions in the floor of the cave, and a single object that looks like a tool may be of natural origin. Heidelberg man. Oddly enough, this very interesting human species, from an evolutionary point of view, was not of much interest to scientists for a long time. The first discoveries related to Heidelberg man occurred in the mid-19th century. At that time, quite a lot was already known about both Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons. But Scientists have not yet thought much about the intermediate link between primitive erecti and fairly developed later sapiens. Meanwhile, the heidelbergensis, which lived in Africa, Europe, and Asia around 800 to 130,000 years ago, had many interesting traits and skills. In terms of brain size, they are already very close to modern humans, and they were the first to begin building some semblance of full-fledged dwellings and produced fairly high-quality and functional tools. But their main achievement was the taming of fire. If at the sites of primitive people 400,000 years old, there were no traces of fires, already 350,000 years ago, they were present in many caves and open areas. All these achievements allowed humanity to begin settling in areas with temperate climate. It is believed that the part of the Heidelberg people who moved to Europe became the ancestors of the Neanderthals. This happened around 300,000 years ago. There is also an opinion that our immediate ancestors descended from those who remained in Africa approximately 100 to 200,000 years ago. But it is possible that the branches of development of Homo sapiens and Homo heidelberg diverged even earlier. Populations that found themselves on different continents were isolated from each other for a long time. This is what explains such significant differences in the structure of their descendants. Externally, heidelbergensis or pre-Paleoanthropus were in many ways similar to Neanderthals. More precisely, these Paleoanthropes retained the features of their ancestors. They had skulls with thick walls, pronounced brow ridges, and massive sloping chins with low foreheads. But by that time, the dental arch had already acquired its modern shape. The average height of man was even greater than that of the Neanderthals. He was approximately 165 to 175 centimeters. Women were slightly shorter. There is evidence that representatives of the African branch even grew up to 2 meters. They lived in small family groups of several dozen individuals. They obtained food through gathering and hunting. Most likely, several clans periodically organized driven hunts for horses, elephants, bison, and other large ungulates. In their way of life, they were not much different from all other tribes of hunter-gatherers, including modern primitive peoples. In addition to the presence of man-made dwellings and skills in handling fire, Heidelberg man was also characterized by other qualities. These are archaeological findings that support care for the weaker and infirm members of family groups. Also, the structure of their brain suggests the possible presence of primitive speech. There are also signs of primitive funeral rites. Found tools up to 500,000 years old are made not only functionally, but also beautifully in their own way. Among the finds are ochre and other simple dyes. All this means that these ancient people were sufficiently socialized and had an understanding of art. Javantrop. These ancient people from the island of Java are called Nang Dong, or Soloi people. The first discoveries of their fossilized remains were made near the village of Nang Dong, on the banks of Solo River. Here, in the early 30s of the last century, the remains of 12 individuals of different ages were discovered. 8 adults of different sexes, 1 male child, and 3 skeletons of unknown age and gender. There is no exact estimate of the age of these remains yet. Different research methods give a range from 143 to 546,000 years old. The structure of the Javanthropus skull is close to the skulls of Pithecanthropus and Sinanthropus. They have an oval shape with a sloping forehead and a protruding occipital part. The average brain volume of adults is 1,100 cubic centimeters. Scientists were able to accurately estimate the height of only one female, and it was equal to 158 centimeters. She weighed around 51 kilograms. The males were obviously a little larger. Presumably, their habitat was open forest spaces. They lived next to animals such as elephants, tapirs, tigers, and river buffaloes. There are finds in the form of simple tool and wooden flakes. This speaks of the possibility of creating primitive tools. Like many other ancient people, Javanthrops were hunter-gatherers. There were also suggestions about the prevalence of cannibalism among them. The group discovered on the banks of the Solo River most likely died during a volcanic eruption. As a species, they began to disappear approximately 125,000 years ago due to the spread of tropical forests. Modern science suggests that Javanthrops could not have been the ancestors of the local inhabitants. At the moment, they are considered a dead-end branch of evolution. This first settlement of people in this region occurred 55 to 40,000 years ago. Man of Flores. This species was discovered relatively recently and still hides quite a lot of mysteries. The fact is that in 2003, the fossilized remains of several unusual people were discovered in one of the caves of the island of Flores in Indonesia. Their average height was around 1 meter. For this, they received the unofficial nickname Hobbits. The first analysis showed that their age ranged around 12 to 74,000 years. That is, scientists have suggested that hobbits were the last neighbors of our species. But later studies showed that the Floresian man became extinct no earlier than 60,000 years ago. Also, tools were discovered next to human bones, the age of which estimated to a range of 50 to 190,000 years. Despite having a brain of about 400 cubic centimeters, these primitive people could be quite developed and intelligent. The body structure of the hobbits was quite bizarre. They had short legs, and their hands and wrists were a rather primitive structure. At the same time, the thumbs were designed almost like those of modern people. The skull of the Flores man was low and flattened with a prominent facial part and pronounced brow ridges. It was an isolated island population. Hobbits coexisted with Komodo dragons, large carnivorous birds, and other predators, many of which were larger than them. Therefore, the main food of the Flores people was various plants. They could also hunt small animals and birds. And at the same time, they used primitive tools and knew about fire. The biggest mystery for scientists is the origin of the hobbits from Flores. According to one version, they are descendants from an Asian branch of Homo erectus. According to another, hobbits descended directly from African habilis. While some scientists express the opinion that the inhabitants of Flores are the descendants of the first representatives of sapiens, who began expanding into the Pacific Islands earlier than the rest of their fellow tribesmen. Dwarfism is a common trait in a wide variety of isolated populations. The main version of scientists is as follows. Whoever the ancestors of these halflings were, they decreased in size after arriving on the island. But this version does not fit the find made in 2017. The remains of an even smaller humanoid creature were also discovered there. By all indications, it lived here before all the hobbits discovered before. Their age is approximately 700,000 years. This means that the ancestors of Flores man came to the island straight from Africa. It was simply unrealistic to overcome such a distance by sea at that time. The only plausible explanation is the ancestors of the hobbits were brought by some kind of natural disaster, like a giant tsunami. But this version is currently not confirmed by anything. Maybe later remains of an intermediate species between Homo flores and Homo habilis will be discovered. Then, scientists will have more harmonious versions of the origin of this species. Denisovans. Denisov Cave in Altai has a very convenient location and configuration. It's not surprising for thousands of years it served as a haven for a wide variety of ancient people. During excavations that began in 1977, the remains of both our ancestors and Neanderthals were discovered in different time layers. By that time, science was actively using technologies for obtaining DNA from fossils. The genetic codes of Neanderthals and ancient sapiens have already been obtained and deciphered. But it turned out that the DNA of the owners of one tooth and a phalanx of a finger from the Denisov cave belonged to a completely new species. Also attributed to him were 2 more teeth discovered back in 1984. Based on such a small number of finds, it was difficult to judge the appearance and lifestyle of Denisovan man. But it's safe to say that they were dark-skinned, black-haired, and brown-eyed. But now it is no longer a secret that Cro-Magnons, Neanderthals, and Denisovans could have had common offspring. The genes of the modern population of the Earth contain traces of the DNA from all three species, but the descendants of sapiens and Neanderthal are mainly found in Europe and the Middle East, and traces of Denisovan DNA were found in the inhabitants of the South Pacific region, right up to Australia. There's also evidence that Denisovan man could interbreed with a certain fourth species of people that are still unknown to science. It is believed that the ancestors of the Denisovans came out of Africa separately from the ancestors of modern sapiens and settled Asia and the Pacific Islands. Having reached the territory of modern Indonesia, they could move north along the Yangtze River. This is how they ended up in the vicinity of that very cave. This is the only human species to date that has been described solely by DNA analysis. Therefore, many scientists are still cautious about identifying Denisovans as a separate species of people, as they have not even been given an official Latin name yet. Throughout history, people have resolved their conflicts primarily with weapons. Mankind waged wars for economic, political, religious, racial, and other reasons. Many scientists suggest that the meeting of our distant ancestors with the Neanderthals could not have ended in anything but a war of extermination. Today, we will try to understand the causes and consequences of this first global war in the history of our planet. If you're interested in information about scientific discoveries and hypotheses in the field of paleontology and anthropology, as well as other related sciences, then we advise you to subscribe to our channel. To promote our videos according to the algorithms, we encourage our viewers to actively share comments and put likes under the releases they like. People against people has always been the reason for the destruction of our own kind. Back in the day of the primitive communal system, any stranger who was at least somewhat different from the locals was perceived as a threat. The simplest and safest solution for the clan or tribe was to kill them. If such a stranger was very different from a representative of one species, then the conversation with him was very short. So the Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals hardly had a chance for a peaceful resolution of the conflict over territory. Despite the almost complete genetic similarity of these two branches of humanity, outwardly, Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals differed very much. Our ancestors, who came to Europe and the Middle East almost 70,000 years later, met here with the Neanderthals, who had been living in this territory for a long time. These natives were shorter than they were, more stocky and broad-shouldered. Also, Neanderthals had a sloping chin, a wider nose, and a massive brow ridge. Their maximum height did not exceed 165 centimeters. The structure of the body of the Cro-Magnons was close to the structure of modern people living in tropical areas. Their height could exceed 180 centimeters. They had long legs, and their faces looked like the current inhabitants of the Earth. It is noteworthy that the brains of babies of both species who entered the struggle for new lands were completely identical. But with age, the differences became more. Although the total brain volume of adults did not differ much, it is believed that the main problem of the Neanderthals in this regard was the less developed cerebellum. This part of the brain is responsible for motor coordination, memory, imagination, and most importantly, speech and social skills. An important survival ability of the Cro-Magnons was the ability to unite in relatively large groups to solve common problems. Neanderthals lived in small, most likely family groups, and although they already had many of the hallmarks of a nascent primitive society, more sociable competitors outstripped them in this component of development. Judging by various archaeological finds, the Neanderthals had concepts of medicine. They took care of the elderly and the crippled. There are suggestions that the concept of religion and art had already begun to emerge in their minds. The simplest explanation for the disappearance of the Neanderthals is their destruction by Homo sapiens. It is quite possible that as such, there was no global armed conflict between these species. It's just that the more numerous and organized Cro-Magnons gradually forced out the indigenous inhabitants of Europe to areas less favorable for living. The process of the destruction of the Neanderthals lasted approximately 30 to 35,000 years as the new owners of the continent settled from Africa. The aliens were able to quickly adapt to colder climates and create better tools and weapons. Neanderthals used only primitive spears and clubs in hunting and war. By the end of the confrontation, their rivals had already successfully used spear throwers. This device made it possible to throw a spear much further. Accordingly, Cro-Magnon hunters were more efficient in obtaining food. Both species successfully used the driven method of hunting, but the Cro-Magnons, who were able to interact more efficiently, most likely managed to collect larger hunting parties. An important difference that could have influenced the extinction of the Neanderthals was the diet of different types of the ancient people. Analysis of the remains of different groups of Neanderthals shows that each of them ate a certain set of foods. Some ate only the meat of local ungulates, some collected certain plants, and some got fish or seafood. The disappearance of familiar food associated with its destruction or relocation of the group to a new place led to significant problems. First of all, in more severe conditions, children died. Decreasing birth rates and increasing mortality naturally led to the extinction of the species. Cro-Magnons, on the other hand, ate about the same regardless of the area in which they lived. Basically, their diet consisted of plant foods. The animal component could differ depending on the region and time period. At the beginning and at the end of their appearance in Europe and Asia, our ancestors used different methods of cooking meat. The closer to our time this period, the more perfect were the methods of cooking and the more varied the diet. It has long been no secret that genetic proximity of Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons allowed them to have common offspring. They had a certain common ancestor from which, according to various estimates, both species separated in the period from 200,000 to 1,000,000 years ago. The genes of modern humans contain between 1 and 4% of Neanderthal DNA. Therefore, it is possible that not all of them were destroyed with weapons. Some of them had assimilated by a more advanced species. But more often than not, the conflict of interest ended sadly for one of those parties. You should not think that the Cro-Magnons who came from Africa simply wiped their closest relatives off the face of the earth. Excavations made at the sites of both those and other participants in the events show that Neanderthals were not whipping boys. Scientists regularly find burials with traces of violent death from characteristic weapons. Also, often come across bones with traces of teeth. This shows that both our ancestors and their competitors regularly ate their dead enemies. In addition to these assumptions, some scientists express several more versions. For example, it is believed that an important advantage of the Cro-Magnons in the struggle for a place in the sun was the domestication of the dog. This symbiosis allowed humans to hunt and defend themselves more effectively against threats. The Neanderthals didn't get enough food to survive, but the Cro-Magnons prospered. The founder of this theory, the American scientist Pat Shipman, also believes at the same time Cro-Magnons showed another important property. They have a special mutation as a dominant feature. The sclera of the eyes has acquired a white tint. This allows you to understand where the gaze of the interlocutor is directed. Communication between people became much better, which led to the development of socialization and greater organization. Some scientists suggest that Neanderthals could have been the victim of a global epidemic. They left the African continent 150,000 years earlier than the Cro-Magnons. The microorganisms that appeared during this time, to which they had no immunity, were carried by our ancestors along the entire path of their settlement. These microbes, already safe for Cro-Magnons, caused the extinction of the Neanderthals. Another group of scientists say that the Cro-Magnons did not participate at all in the destruction of their main competitor. Nature herself did it. There is evidence that in places of the greatest concentration of Neanderthals during that period, several large volcanic eruptions occurred. This affected the decrease in temperature and the change in the composition of water and atmosphere. Many animal species that served as the main food of the Neanderthals died out, and after them, starvation awaited people. It doesn't matter which contributed more to the extinction of the Neanderthals. Competition between species occupying the same ecological niche is inevitable in nature. Perhaps under different circumstances, Neanderthals would have had the chance of success, and now human society would exist according to other laws. But to find out if the world of Neanderthals would be better than the one we see now, or we can never get worse.
What if humans ended up in the age of dinosaurs? Human time travel is a typical plot for fantasy novels and movies. The heroes of these works, however, usually find themselves in an era in which some semblance of human society exists. We have many examples in fiction of the adventures of our present-day people in the time of Wild West, the Middle Ages, and even the Stone Age. But not every author dares to take his character hundreds of millions of years back in time to the age of dinosaurs. It's difficult enough to properly describe the nature and living conditions of anyone who somehow incomprehensibly got thrown into a world inhabited by giant reptiles. After all, apart from dinosaurs and other animals, people have to deal with a huge number of nuanced inconveniences, ranging from a different atmospheric composition of climatic conditions and the absence of edible fruits and familiar plants. Learn more about the real flora and fauna of the age of dinosaurs in other videos on our channel. By subscribing, you can be the first to hear about new videos. With the help of likes and comments, any viewer can share their opinions of topics covered in our videos. More often than not, fiction writers place dinosaurs in the conditions that humans are accustomed to. This usually takes place in a remote corner of an unexplored continent, like Conan Doyle in The Lost World, or a small island in the middle of the ocean, like Spielberg in Jurassic Park. But in these cases, there was only one serious danger to humans: the dinosaurs themselves. Not only could these reptiles end up hostile should one intentionally or accidentally end up in the age of dinosaurs, but the entire environment would be alien to human beings. Most likely, an accidental hitchhiker wouldn't even last a few days alone amidst dinosaurs. But a trained group of specialists could not only survive in those alien conditions, but also exist safely in this new world. The first problem to be solved concerning the preparation of such an expedition would be the differing gas composition of the planet's atmosphere. Particularly, during the apex of the dinosaurs' domination, there was significantly less oxygen in the air. It is known that a lack of oxygen can cause a diverse set of consequences. Therefore, the best solution a scientific expedition could take is to bring their own oxygen tanks, with a mixture of gases more familiar to human lungs. Living in workspaces, in this case, would have to be made airtight and make use of appropriate equipment. It's possible the human body's reaction to the dinosaur's atmosphere wouldn't be so threatening, but it's better to be sure. The lack of familiar food won't be any less of a problem. In the age of dinosaurs, not only were there no fruits that humans would be accustomed to, but the trees on which this fruit might hang were absent as well. Naturally, we could try catching food by hunting or fishing, but the ancestors of fish that were evolving during that time were much larger than their present-day descendants and didn't mind feasting on smaller animals that might wander into the water. In the event of a prearranged expedition, the problem of food might not be so pronounced. Firstly, any such group would be provided a sufficient amount of food. There would be a balanced menu, allowing explorers to engage in specific work rather than fret constantly over food. There would also be teams of hunters and fishermen equipment with the knowledge of pursuing local animals without putting their own lives at risk. Undoubtedly, when preparing for long expeditions into the age of dinosaurs, people should bring with them not only a supply of provisions, but also seeds from a modern agricultural produce. Thus, within a few years, a small colony would be able to support itself independently. A lot will also depend on the place where the supposed time traveler might end up. Some scientists believe that the most dangerous place on Earth during the era of dinosaurs was the area now referred to as the modern Sahara Desert. It's difficult regardless for an untrained human to survive in any wilderness alone. There's no need to travel anywhere in time to demonstrate that. The modern taiga, the African savanna, or the circumpolar regions are no less dangerous, and the prospect of being eaten by a lion or a bear is no different than dying at the teeth of a tyrannosaurus. In various parts of the modern Earth, one might also face problems with the climate, finding water and nourishment. Surviving in the Sahara now without equipment is almost impossible, despite its lack of tropical forests inhabited by giant lizards. Finally, let's head to the planetary masters of that era, the dinosaurs. When discussing time traveling to the age of dinosaurs, many people merely imagine adventures to the theme of Jurassic Park movies, where a T-Rex or a Spinosaurus lurks behind every tree. But the laws of nature are unchanging, and they apply just as much then as they do now. The larger the predator, the larger its hunting territory. In the case of large theropods, their territory probably occupied more than an entire square kilometer. Therefore, the probability of encountering the king of beasts as a human being who is of no interest to him as prey wouldn't be very high. As we've already discussed, human beings just wouldn't have been considered food by these large predators. The objective in their hunts was large herbivores. Humans would have needed to handle some animal in their own weight class. Don't think that all reptiles of the time were the size of a truck. Giant dinosaurs were thought to make up only 5% of the total population. The forests in the age of dinosaurs were inhabited by a large number of small lizards. Many of them would have posed little danger to humans. Their main concern was not becoming someone else's dinner, nor would they lively have perceived humans as a threat. The hunting grounds of the modern Amur tiger may exceed 100 square kilometers. The size depends on the amount of prey in the area. Most likely, the Tyrannosaurus and other large predators of the age of dinosaurs occupied a comparable area in which to hunt. There's a good chance that a single man who might end up in that era wouldn't encounter a single T-Rex in his vicinity. Thus, if the issue of reduced oxygen content and the lack of habitual food were solved, it would be quite possible for humans to live alongside the dinosaurs, and a well-armed and prepared group could do it with relative comfort. With weapons, equipment, transport, and building materials, even in the age of dinosaurs, a human could end up the master of the planet. A single person, however, even the most trained individual, would be unlikely to play Robinson for long. Though this applies not only in time travel fantasies, but also in getting through extreme conditions on an otherwise habitable and fairly safe Earth in our present time. Surviving alone in the desert of the taiga, the jungle, or the far north is a difficult and dangerous undertaking even without dinosaurs around.
Australopithecines are considered the most likely ancestor of modern humans. These primitive people lived on the African continent between 7 and 1 million years ago. It was they who first manifested some of the traits that were later characteristic of the genus Homo, that is, people. Scientists now know about several varieties of Australopithecines. In this issue, we will take a closer look at each of them. Australopithecines are an extinct group of the hominid family. During their development, they were upright creatures to varying degrees. Later Australopithecines had already completely switched to walking on 2 legs. It is believed that they lived in small family groups, like modern chimpanzees. The brain volume of Australopithecines was close to the brain volume of these monkeys. Their body proportions were close to those of apes such as bonobos. The height of Australopithecus did not exceed 1.5 meters. Interestingly, The average height of males was 50% greater than that of females. In modern people, this figure does not even exceed 25%. On average, men are only 6 to 10% taller than women and 15% heavier. The name of this ancient anthropoid creature simply means southern monkey. It appears thanks to the place of residence of these ancient people. They lived in areas south of the Sahara Desert. There are also later finds of the remains in North and East Africa. Like chimpanzees, Australopithecines were characterized by associations consisting mainly of males. They controlled a certain territory, protecting their females. It is believed that only young females left the family for other groups, although there is evidence of harems belonging to one male. Australopithecines had a fairly wide pelvis. This made walking on two legs more comfortable. It's unlikely that they were already capable of long journeys on foot, but gradually they were forced to master this method of transportation. At that time, the climate on the planet became hotter and drier. The tropical jungles and the Australopithecus habitats gave way to vast grassy plains. Upright walking became the key to their survival in new conditions. Thanks to this, evolutionary changes occurred, which ultimately led to the emergence of Homo sapiens. The ancestors of modern apes lived in more forested areas. They didn't need to walk on two legs a lot. The trees provided ample food and served as protection from natural enemies. Therefore, modern gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans, and primates have developed completely different skills and structural features. Higher growth allowed our distant ancestors to notice creeping predators in time. Also, with the release of the forelimbs, it became possible to carry cubs in them or take weapons and tools. With the help of a developed thumb set to the side, it was easier and more convenient. Even chimpanzees sometimes use rocks and sticks as weapons or tools, but Australopithecus more often walked on two legs. Therefore, we have achieved a little more in the ability to use available tools. Later representatives of this genus may have been able to independently make primitive stone knives and wooden spears. They ate mainly fruits and nuts. There was practically no meat in their diet. Scientists divide all currently known Australopithecines into three groups. Early, living approximately 4 to 7 million years ago. Gracile, 2 to 4 million years ago. And massive, 1 to 2.5 million years ago. Not much is known about early Australopithecines, but based on the available findings, we can say that they are most likely candidates for the title of transitional link between apes and humans. The earliest of them is considered to be the so-called Sahelanthropus. His partial skull, dating back 6 to 7 million years, was discovered at Toros Manala in the Republic of Chad. This ancient man received the second name Tumei. In Kenya, species of early hominids have been discovered, such as Auroran, who lived here about 6 million years ago, and Australopithecus anima, whose age is approximately 4 million years. Two more species of early Australopithecines lived in Ethiopia. Both of them belong to the genus Ardipithecus. Some remains are 5.5 million years old, others are 4.4 million years old. The height of these creatures was slightly more than 1 meter. They lived mainly in swampy and wooded areas, as well as in forest steeps. All of them were upright, but still retained the ability to climb trees. The teeth of these Australopithecines are intermediate between humans and apes. It is likely that some early Australopithecines occasionally walked on all 4 limbs. At the same time, they rested on the phalanges of the fingers. This manner of movement is characteristic of modern gorillas and chimpanzees. Some scientists have even hypothesized that Sahelanthropus and gorillas are relatives, and chimpanzees are direct descendants of Ardipithecus. We know nothing about the descendants of Australopithecus anima. Perhaps it turned out to be a dead-end branch of development and did not leave any trace in the further history of life on the planet. The gracile Australopithecines are the greatest interest to science. They are the most likely ancestors of humans. At the moment, science is leaning towards the versions of the origins of the genus people, Homo, from Australopithecus afarensis. It is the most famous and well-studied species, living in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Tanzania between 4 and 2.5 million years ago. They found skeletons of these ancient people vary greatly in size. It was probably in them that sexual dimorphism was very pronounced. The smallest skeletons are found just over a meter tall, and the largest are over 1.5. Their weight ranged from 30 to 55 kilograms, respectively. The structure of the pelvic bones of this creature suggests that it moved exclusively on 2 legs. His arms were still a little longer, and his legs shorter than those of modern people. The structure of the skull of the Australopithecus afarensis contained features characteristic of apes and massive Australopithecines. But he already has completely human characteristics. They also had protruding upper fangs, but these teeth are already much smaller in size than those of their ancestors. The most famous afarensis is a female named Lucy. Her skeleton was discovered in 1974. It is the most complete skeleton of the species. About 40% of the bones are preserved. It is believed that this young female died as a result of an unfortunate fall from a tree. Before Lucy's discovery, scientists had only a few femur bones and a knee joint at their disposal. One of the descendants of the afarensis is an Australopithecus africanus. He lived in South Africa approximately 2.5 million years ago. In this structure, this species is even closer to modern humans, but he still has some monkey traits. The first and most famous discovery of the remains of this species is the so-called Child of Tong. It was a partially preserved skull of a teenager found in 1925. While studying it, Raymond Arthur Dart put forward the version that it was an upright creature. This is indicated by the anterior location of the foramen magnum. It is believed that the massive Australopithecus, or Paranthropus, and humans also descended from Australopithecus afarensis. Homo erectus appeared on the planet at the same time, approximately 2.5 million years ago. But the massive Australopithecus eventually died out about 1 million years ago, and the descendants of Erectus continued to develop successfully. With a small stature, like all Australopithecines, Paranthropus had a very massive body. For example, the most famous of them, Bayeu's Paranthropus, had a height of 1.2 meters and weighed from 40 to 90 kilograms. Also, Paranthropus apparently relied on a large skull, or more precisely, a highly developed jaw apparatus. The jaw structure is typically for animals to feed on tough plant foods, leaves, stems, and roots, but most likely ate fruits, berries, and insects like termites. They did not eat meat at all. Some scientists claim that the human branch separated from the Australopithecus much earlier. They believe that our distant ancestors developed simultaneously with the gracile Australopithecines. Whether this is true or not has not yet been definitively established. But the evolution of these primates clearly shows us how the transition to bipedal walking affected the success of their existence. Lucy and Baby of Tong may not be human ancestors, but merely cousins. But our ancestors in those days looked and lived exactly the same. Neanderthals, extinct about 40,000 years ago, were the closest relatives of modern man. They left Africa long before the Cro-Magnons and settled almost exclusively throughout the Middle East and Europe. But our ancestors were more socialized and were better able to adapt to changes in living conditions. They destroyed or drove the Neanderthals from habitable lands. True, part of the Neanderthals, most likely, was assimilated by the Cro-Magnons. This means that in our blood, there is certain proportions of their genes. Therefore, the study of Neanderthals is important for science. The discoveries connected with them allow us to better understand the nature of some of our abilities. We encourage science lovers to actively subscribe to the Age of Dinosaurs channel, as well as comment on our videos and put likes. This will allow you to be the first to know about the release of new materials, and will help as many other users as possible get to our channel. Contrary to popular belief, Neanderthals rarely used natural caves as dwellings. Most of the sites of these ancient people were found near the entrances. And in the caves themselves, there were burials and other traces of activity. Perhaps some rituals were performed in such shelters, or they could serve as a temporary shelter. Maybe the legends about gnomes, trolls, kobolds, and other underground inhabitants appeared during the meetings of our ancestors with the last Neanderthals. The Neanderthals themselves were short and stocky. Their average height did not exceed 165 centimeters. They also had massive foreheads and pronounced brow ridges. The chin, on the other hand, was slanted. Neanderthals wore skins, used primitive tools and weapons. There are finds of jewelry that could be of the ritual nature as well. They lived in small family groups and ate mainly meat. Near their sites, bones of large ungulates, including mammoths and woolly rhinos, were found. The driven method was used to hunt such large prey. Perhaps several genera could work together for this, but it is unlikely that such associations were created for a long time. They did not have a developed speech. And without a food production technology, it did not allow for feeding of large groups in one area. In just a century and a half of research, more than 500 burials were discovered. Many of them were massive and contained the remains of several dozen people. Some of the skeletons have been preserved in excellent condition and allowed scientists to find out previously unknown details of the life of Neanderthals. There's no point in describing each of these finds. We will try to highlight the most interesting of them all and talk about the most important stages in the study of Neanderthals. The first known finds related to Neanderthals were explored in the first half of the 19th century, but these bones were identified as Neanderthal much later. The name of the previously unknown human species was given by a find made in 1856 in the Neanderthal Gorge in Germany. The fragments of bones found here and the skull, covered for several years, became the subject of fierce disputes between scientists. Only in 1863, at a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, it was proclaimed that these bones belonged to a separate species of ancient people. Later, it turned out that similar finds had already taken place. So, the skull discovered in 1848 in Gibraltar did not attract the attention of the scientific community. The German scientist Rudolf Virchow considered differences in structure to be signs of rickets. It was possible to prove that these differences are not individual, but racial, which also later turned out to be incorrect. Only in 1864, after the discovery of a skull from a Neanderthal. A detailed description of the Gibraltar specimen was not made until 1907. An even earlier find, a child's skull, found in Belgium in 1830, was attributed to Neanderthal only 100 years after discovery. In the same place in Belgium, during excavations of the Spee Cave in 1886, the skeletons of a man and a woman were found. But it was not the bones themselves that turned out to be more important for science, but the fact that Neanderthal tools were found next to them. This discovery was the next step in the recognition of Neanderthals as a separate species of people. But at the same time, the researchers made a mistake in describing the structure of the limbs. They considered that Neanderthals constantly moved on half-bent legs. Such conclusions of scientists for a long time fixed the image of primitive cavemen for Neanderthals. In 1901, the German anthropologist Gustav Schwab substantiated the theory that Neanderthals are an independent species of man. Before that, it was believed that they are a separate extinct race of Homo sapiens. Also at the end of the 19th century, the hypothesis that Neanderthals were an intermediate link between Pithecanthropes and modern humans became widespread. In his later work, Schwab also considers another option, that Neanderthals were a dead-end branch of development related to modern people. This theory was also supported by the French scientist Marcelin Boule. In the years 1911 through 1913, in the annual edition of the Annals of Paleontology, his work is published under the title Fossil Man from La Chapelle à Seine. After that, for several generations of scientists, the Neanderthal became a primitive troglodyte with a stooped back, a crooked neck, and head tilted forward, and half-bent knees. The author of the theory of the settlement of America through a land bridge on the site of the Bering Strait, the American scientist Alesh Hydrikla, was a supporter of the opposite version. In his speech of the occasion of the award of the Huxley Medal to him in 1927, he speaks of the direct descendant of modern humans from Neanderthals. Also, an opponent of Boule's theory was the Frenchman Camille Arambert. In 1955, this anthropologist took an X-ray of his spine. Based on it, he proved that the stoop of Neanderthals is a consequence of osteoarthritis. In healthy individuals, such sign of similarity with monkeys are not observed. Also, anthropologist Carlton Kuhn, in his book The Origin of Races, published in 1962, suggested that many of the features characteristic of Neanderthals were the result of life in the harsh European climate of the Ice Age. Also, in the late 70s of the last century, several studies of Neanderthal skulls were published. Comparison with finds from Africa and Southeast Asia showed that Neanderthals did not live in these territories, and the bones and skulls found there belonged to other types of ancient people. With the advent of new research methods, more detailed data about the life and origin of Neanderthals became available to scientists. In 1991, carbon analysis was used to study the diet of groups living in different areas. In 1997, a group of German scientists was able to extract a section of mitochondrial DNA from the bones of Neanderthals. This section was compared with a similar section of modern human DNA. In 2008, the mitochondrial DNA of Neanderthals was completely deciphered, and in 2010, scientists also read their nuclear DNA. Among the latest discoveries related to Neanderthals, the following studies deserve special attention. A strong bite. There was an opinion that the characteristics facing with the high cheekbones helped Neanderthals bite harder. Some researchers even suggested that they helped themselves with their teeth when carrying things or other operations. But the reconstruction of their jaws has shown that they are far superior in bite force compared to the more elegant jaws of modern humans. Wide noses. It is assumed that the wider nose was a result of living in cold climates. This shape of the nostrils allowed you to warm the inhaled air more efficiently. Scientists also suggest that the massive bodies of Neanderthals needed more oxygen. Wide nostrils provided them with almost 30% increase compared to Cro-Magnons. Slow development. A study of the skeleton of a 7-year-old Neanderthal boy led scientists to the following conclusion. Neanderthal children develop more slowly than sapien children. Although he was no different in height from a modern 7-year-old child, his brain volume was only 87.5% of that of an adult. For modern people, this figure is 95%. Also, in this child, not all vertebrae was fused. In modern children, this process ends by 4 to 6 years. Ability for fine work. Scientists compared the hands of representatives of various modern professions with the hands of the ancient Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals. It turned out that half of the Cro-Magnons had signs of people doing fine work. At the same time, such signs were found in all studied Neanderthals. Flu protection. On average, the genome of each inhabitant of the Earth contains about 2% of the genes inherited from Neanderthals, or our common ancestors. But recent studies have shown that it is in the DNA of the Neanderthal that there is a protective mechanism against influenza viruses. Scientists have suggested that the Neanderthals who settled Europe before the Cro-Magnons were able to develop immunity to this disease and passed it on through common descendants. It is possible that without this protection, our ancestors would have simply died out, unable to adapt to the virus. A similar situation arose with the genes that protect against hepatitis C. Perhaps our ancestors inherited many other abilities from their extinct relatives, but even this knowledge of Neanderthals tells us that without them, the history of mankind could have taken a very different path. Cro-Magnons are people of the modern type who are our immediate ancestors. Their lifestyle, appearance, and area of settlement have been studied by science quite well. This data allows us to say with confidence that they did not much differ from the modern inhabitants of our planet. But in order to become the dominant species of the planet, the Cro-Magnons had to overcome many difficulties and adapt to a variety of conditions of existence. Subscribe to the channel Age of Dinosaurs. Our subscribers will be the first to know about the release of new videos, and your likes and comments under the videos help promote them according to the algorithms on the platform. Thanks to this, more and more fans of dinosaurs and other prehistoric creatures will learn about us. Scientists do not have a consensus on the place and time of the appearance of this type of reasonable person. The main version says that the Cro-Magnons appeared in Africa about 200,000 years ago. From there, they first moved into the Middle East and then to Europe. It happened about 40,000 years ago. At this time, most of the continent remained under the rule of the glacier. Therefore, the first habitats of Cro-Magnons were the territories of modern South European states, Spain, Italy, the countries of the Balkan Peninsula. Now, scientists know hundreds of permanent Cro-Magnon sites throughout Europe, Africa, and Asia. The largest of them are Maldek and Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, Paveland in England, Peštericu Aus in Romania, Mirzakoba in the Crimea, Sungir in Russia, Mezerek in Ukraine, Fishhook, Cape Flats in Africa. This type of Homo sapien got its name from the Cro-Magnon Hill in southern France. Here, during roadworks in 1868, the remains of ancient people were discovered, identified as a new species. But scientists have seen similar findings before. In 1771, bones of a cave bear and other extinct animals were discovered in a cave near the German city of Bamberg. Among them were human remains. But the local pastor who made the discovery thought that they got there by accident. In 1823, a female skeleton without a skull was found in Wales. Tools were found next to it. It is noteworthy that all the bones were painted red. For this, the sample received the nickname Red Lady. In 1852, the remains of 17 people were discovered in the Orgnac cave in the foothills of the Pyrenees in southern France. First, local authorities ordered to bury them in the local cemetery, but later, all the remains were dug up and examined by scientists. The French anthropologist Louis Larty is considered the discoverer of the Cro-Magnon man. It was he who led the expedition that discovered and examined the remains of 5 ancient people in the Cro-Magnon cave. These skeletons belonged to 3 adult men, 1 woman, and a small child. Stone scrapers, drilled shells, and other tools were also found on them. This discovery turned the then idea of the origin of modern people. Before that, it was believed that our direct ancestor was a Neanderthal. But accepting such a relative was difficult even for some scientists. These same remains belong to people of the modern type, who practically did not differ from us. It is now known that despite their close relationship, the Neanderthals were not the ancestors of the Cro-Magnons. The branches of development of these species were divided even before the Neanderthals left Africa about 200 to 300,000 years ago. The southwestern territories of modern France were distinguished by a mild climate, an abundance of rivers, and a huge number of limestone grottos and caves. The water washed them into the soft rock, creating natural shelters for our distant ancestors. But before the Cro-Magnons, Neanderthals also lived in many of these caves. In the lower layers of the excavation, there are traces of the presence of these, our relatives. True, most scientists are inclined to believe that neither one nor the other lived in the caves for a long time. This is especially true for later Cro-Magnons. Their camps were most often located near the entrances to the caves. Perhaps they used such natural spaces as temporary shelters. Also, the caves could serve for any ritual event, funerals, initiation of hunters, and other ceremonies. In terms of brain size, they were in no way inferior to modern humans. On average, they were taller and more massive than the modern inhabitants of the Earth. Their average height was about 180 centimeters. According to the structure of the body, they represented representatives of the Negroid race. It is also reliably known that they had swarthy skin and predominantly dark hair. The Cro-Magnons led a nomadic lifestyle. Their tribal communities could number up to 100 people. There is evidence that in later periods, they could unite in more numerous clans and settle in one particular area. It is quite possible that these routes of their seasonal wanderings ran from one cave to another. With the development of crafts, they learned to sew warm clothes and durable dwellings from skins. Therefore, they stopped using caves for housing. Also in the process of their development, the Cro-Magnons mastered fire, the manufacturing of complex tools and weapons, and their own medicine, culture, and the beginnings of religion. Some scientists believe that one of the main reasons for the Cultural Revolution and the dominance of this species on the planet were changes in material processing technology. In particular, this applies to stone tools and weapons. They were the first who began to use in large quantities. Also, products made of bones and horns were used by late Cro-Magnons. But it was the stone that was the main raw material used by Cro-Magnons, Neanderthal, and as well as earlier and primitive Archanthropes. In the mass consciousness, this period of human development is even known as the Stone Age. The Cro-Magnons began to use this important strategic resource more rationally. This allowed them to be less dependent on the reserves and deposits of necessary rocks. According to researchers, from 1 kilogram of stone raw materials, Archanthropes received on average from 10 to 45 centimeters of useful working edge. Neanderthal craftsmen made a little more than 200 centimeters of working edge from the same amount of stone, and the technologies used by our ancestors gave a result of 25 meters. The secret of this economical use of materials was the so-called knife plate method. It consisted in breaking off long and thin plates from a piece of ore, which served as blanks for the manufacture of various tools. A piece of flint from which the plates broke off scientists call the nucleus. It, as a rule, had the form of a prism with a flat top. Its length at the base was 25 to 30 centimeters. Accordingly, the length of each plate was the same. They were broken off with the help of a ringing tool, from bone or from horn. It was also possible to obtain a plate by precise blows to the edge of the nucleus with another hard stone. The craftsmen of the Cro-Magnons made it possible to obtain plates only a few millimeters thick. All this contributed not only to an increase in labor productivity due to the use of more advanced tools. Cro-Magnons became more mobile and could occupy larger territories than their competitors. A hunting party or a nomadic clan could take with them a very small supply of stone and raw materials. This allowed them to move further away from their usual habitats in search of prey and more favorable living conditions. Another important feature of the Cro-Magnons was the presence of coherent speech. This is evidenced by studies of the structure of their vocal apparatus. Our ancestors were social beings. Through communication between individuals and entire groups, there was an exchange of knowledge and technology. Together, it was also easier to hunt and defend against enemies. But the main thing is that with the advent of speech and culture, people began to pass on the experience of previous generations to their descendants. Now, the training was conducted not only by personal example, it became more extensive and more comprehensive. Statements regularly appear in various pseudoscientist circles that humanity is not the first civilization on Earth. A large number of hypotheses are put forward, supported by a variety of arguments. Some of them do not stand up to any, even the most primitive criticism. Others are quite justified, but have not yet been confirmed in any way by real archaeology and other scientists. Today, we're going to talk about where such theories come from and what real benefits scientists can derive from such research. Subscribe to our channel and you'll be the first to know about the release of new videos, and keep abreast of a scientific view on the development of life on our planet. We also encourage viewers to more actively express their opinions in the comments and support the work of the channel creators with likes. Even in the comments under our videos, the opinions of those who deny the theory of evolution and doubt the veracity of the conclusions made by scientists often appear. All over the world, supporters of the flat Earth theory and other anti-scientific theories have become more active. Therefore, it's not surprising that people find evidence of the presence of unknown civilizations in a variety of things. But for a full discussion on this topic, we first need to decide what civilization is. In different contexts, this concept has many interpretations and definitions. The word itself comes from the Latin concept meaning state or civil. Back in the 19th century, Adam Ferguson proposed 3 stages of social development: savagery, barbarism, and civilization. And now, this word often refers to certain social, cultural, technical, and other achievements of mankind. It is believed that civilization must have certain characteristics, such as class division of society, availability of states, invention of writing, legislation and tax system, construction of cities, availability of crafts, construction of monumental buildings, own science and art. Using these certain criteria, various scientists have identified up to 21 civilizations. Many researchers have defined civilizations according to cultural, religious, and geopolitical parameters. You can often hear expressions such as Egyptian civilization, Slavic civilization, Roman, and so on. More broadly, according to cultural characteristics, the so-called Western and Eastern civilizations can be distinguished. An example of a religious division is the presence of a Christian, or more narrowly, Orthodox civilization. In 1959, after lengthy discussions, it was decided to reduce the number of signs of civilization to 3 main ones: writing, cities, and monuments. Even if we do not take into account local civilizations such as the Babylonian, Slavic, and others, the global human civilization has all these features. Supporters of the existence of other earthly civilizations more ancient than humanity gives various arguments in favor of their existence. No matter who ruled this planet before humans, if we take into account the theory of their existence, they must have left some evidence of their signs of civilization. Let us immediately make a reservation that the arguments that scientists across the world have conspired and are hiding the truth from people can be called absolute nonsense. The goal of life of a real scientist, regardless of what science he's engaged in, is to search for the truth. The discovery of evidence confirming or refuting any theory will immediately perpetuate the name of the discoverer for centuries. During the existence of science, its official view on many issues has changed a huge number of times. Sometimes new evidence completely turned the idea of a particular subject to the exact opposite. It's the illustration of such things that we can cite our long understanding about the discovery and study of Spinosaurs. In about 100 years, its appearance in scientific reconstructions has changed beyond recognition. The reason for this was the discovery and the description of new fossils. Among the most popular representatives of other civilizations who lived on Earth, there are often 5 or 6 meter giants. There are also versions about the immigrants from other planets with their blasters and spaceships. Also, let's not forget the reptilians. We can't live without them now. Those who believe in their existence cite either the Egyptian pyramids or Stonehenge as evidence. According to these people, our ancestors were so primitive that they could not build structures of such a cyclopean scale. On one good educational internet portal, they even came up with a special name for such people: unskilled. These same unskilled are not embarrassed by the presence of dozens, maybe hundreds, of experiments to restore the technologies of that time. Using a bronze tool available to the ancient Egyptians, scientists sawed limestone, obtaining blocks of the required size. They also moved stones like that of the form of the base of Stonehenge and set them upright. That is, the builders of these monumental structures did not necessarily have to be huge in size or use alien technology. In addition, it's worth remembering that writing and statehood are important signs of civilization. The ancient Egyptian civilization had complete order with this. Even they had a serious bureaucracy and reporting. And if no drawings or descriptions of construction technology had been discovered yet, then invoices for the delivery of materials, tools, and provisions to the shock construction sites of ancient Egypt fell into the hands of scientists quite a long time ago. But archives and libraries written by ancient reptilians or giants have not been yet made public anywhere. There is no evidence of finds of skeletons of giant humanoids in caves in Alaska during the gold rush or in any other place. But the most stubborn supporters of such fabrications managed to declare that under Peter the Giant, no one built St. Petersburg on the shores of the Gulf of Finland. It was abandoned by ancient giants and was simply completely dug out of the ground. Indeed, in many houses, the ceiling height exceeds 5 to 6 meters. At the same time, no one's bothered by the presence of a large number of buildings with normal ceilings, in which 6-meter giants could probably only crawl. It is also interesting that millions of years ago, someone built a city following the architectural fashion of the early 18th century. Probably the same theories will be born in the heads of our descendants when archaeologists dig up buildings like the Kremlin Palace or the production workshops of Eurovagon Savod. So, we cannot attribute any of the known monumental buildings to the creation of non-human technologies. Little is known about the writing of disappeared civilizations. The presence of cities built by representatives of other intelligent species is also a big question. Judging by the history of human development, the presence of a highly developed technical civilization should leave quite a lot of traces. The planet will have to deal with the waste of our modern industry for many more tens of millions of years. But neither on the seabed nor in the depths of Earth's crust has a single artifact been found that was 100% made by someone else. But the issue of searching for lost civilizations can also be approached from a scientific point of view. By studying the impact of human activity on climate change, we can identify time periods in the history of our planet with similar changes. Climatologist Gavin Schmidt and astronomer Adam Frank, in the course of similar studies, put forward the so-called Silurian hypothesis. It got its name from the race of intelligent reptiles from the TV series Doctor Who live on Earth in the Silurian period. It is this hypothesis that supporters of the overwhelming majority of conspiracy theories rely on. But we should not forget that it is still a hypothesis, that is, an assumption that requires verification and proof, as the educational animated series Dinosaur Train teaches us. The essence of the hypothesis is that in the history of the Earth, there has already been at least one technically advanced civilization. Traces of such a civilization should be looked for by changes in the planetary climate and the presence of isotopic anomalies of various chemical elements, including oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, and uranium. The most important problem of those conspiracy theorists who refer to the Silurian hypothesis is that it is unsubstantiated. The scientists themselves created it to assess the possibility of searching for life on other planets. In relation to the Earth, at the moment, the influence of a technically advanced civilization can only be assessed by the activities of people. Since the mid-18th century, a huge amount of hydrocarbon combustion products, coal, oil, gas, have been released into the atmosphere. There is also a massive loss of forests, changes in the landscape, and a large amount of plastic waste. In different geological periods, climate and landscape changes took place, but scientists have not yet been able to detect other traces of the presence of a man-made civilization of terrestrial or extraterrestrial origin. In their research, Frank and Schmidt rely heavily on the Drake equation. Astrophysicist Frank Drake developed this formula in 1961 to theoretically estimate the number of advanced civilizations that our Milky Way galaxy can accommodate. It takes into account such parameters as rate of star formation in our galaxy, percentage of stars that have planets, the number of terrestrial planets around each star that has planets, percentage of terrestrial planets that have developed life, percentage of planets with life on which intelligent life has evolved, the percentage of intelligent species that have developed technologies that can be discovered by an external civilization like ours, for example, radio signals, and the average number of years required for an advanced civilization to detect detectable signals. Since then, scientists have learned to determine the rate of star formation and have discovered many theoretical suitable planets for life. But so far, only humanity is responsible for the indicator of the presence of actually found intelligent civilizations. Finding actual traces of another civilization will immediately increase the mathematical chances that we are not alone in this universe. I would like to believe that in the future, we will not be able to argue with the unfounded arguments of supporters of conspiracy theorists, but to begin to establish interaction with our neighbors in the galaxy. If you are more interested in getting acquainted with the real achievements of modern scientists, well, we recommend that you pay attention to previous issues. They talk about scientifically proven hypotheses about the emergence of life on Earth and the evolution of various species of living beings. What if we have to rebuild human society from the ground up? Their versions of the end of the world are predicted both in the religious texts of different peoples and confessions and in world art culture in the forms of films, computer games, and books. And each of these works expresses different views on how people will cope with the consequences of the apocalypse and restore civilization. Today, we will try to guess how far humanity will roll back in its technological development and how difficult it'll be for people to restore the lost knowledge. Viewers who are interested in the development of life on our planet in different periods of its existence and new scientific achievements in this area, we suggest subscribing to our channel. This will allow you to be the first to know about the releases of new videos and leave your comments underneath them. You can also help promote the channel with likes. The cause of the end of the world can be events such as global natural disasters, pandemics of various deadly diseases, or nuclear war. All these events are capable of taking the lives of most of the planet's population and destroying the existing system of production of the necessary goods. But in this video, we're not going to consider the ways to survive in the radioactive wastelands among gangs of marauders or fight hordes of zombies eager to eat everyone they can reach. Let's try to simulate a situation when, as a result of the end of the world, there were suddenly practically no people left on Earth. For example, suddenly all people were infected with a deadly virus, and most of them could not cope with the disease. At the same time, before their death, all of them carefully drowned out all nuclear reactors, stopped transport, drained water at the dams of hydroelectric power plants, parked all vehicles, landed all planes, stopped trains, turned off water, gas, and electricity. That is, the surviving handful of people got a clean and almost safe planet, not affected by radiation, acid rain, hurricanes, tsunamis, and earthquakes, with a familiar climate and other living conditions. Often, there's an opinion that in such case, humanity will roll back to the Stone Age. But it would be more like the Middle Ages. But even in the Middle Ages, throughout their entire length, people lived in different ways. But where we get to live, in the Dark Ages or in the Renaissance, depends on a large number of factors. The survival of mankind and the speed of its return to the modern level depends on many factors. This is the quantitative and qualitative composition of the groups of survivors and the ability of relevant materials, such as information, as well as the social system that people will eventually come to in the first days after the death of the world. Already in the 18th century, scientists began to think about a way to preserve technological and cultural knowledge in the event of the collapse of civilization. In 1751, Denis Diderot published his encyclopedia. In this colossal work, he tried to fit the maximum amount of knowledge, fearing that the then European civilization would disappear, like it happened with the Roman Empire or ancient Egypt. These fears of one of the greatest educators were well-founded. Archaeology tells us that many of these technologies used by ancient Romans were lost in the Middle Ages, and subsequently, people had to reinvent many things. A completely different approach to the restoration of society was proposed in the 20th century by the American psychist Richard Feynman. His theory was that people should receive from previous generations only on the basis from which all other specific data can be derived anew. The scientists believed that this basis can serve as a single phrase. All things are made up of atoms, the smallest particles in constant motion, attracted to each other when there is a small distance between them, but mutually repelling when they are brought closer. It's interesting to think how long it would take for a person who has descended to the level of almost a caveman in his development to be able to unleash this postulate, at least for obtaining the first meals and making tools from them. Probably, civilization will recover faster if people are given a set of simpler and more effective tips. Like the old joke goes, that the only book you need to take with you to a desert island is a textbook on agriculture. And that sounds pretty appropriate. Therefore, not so long ago, science journalist Lewis Dartnell published the book Civilization from Scratch: What You Need to Know to Be Able to Survive After a Global Catastrophe. Although this book also contains a large number of practical tips and recommendations for surviving in a post-apocalyptic environment, this is not the main idea of the author. He says that when writing the book, he tried to make sure that after reading it, an inquisitive person could begin his development, avoiding the mistakes made along the way made by our civilization. Dartnell wants people to get on the right track right away and get where they want to go as soon as possible. But most likely, even with the ideal scenario of the end of the world that was planned at the beginning of the video, it will be very difficult for the surviving people to follow at least some kind of plan. So, back to the first question asked earlier. How many people are needed to restore the human population? Some conditional Adam and Eve will obviously not be enough to obtain the entire diversity of the modern human population. If only a single man and a single woman remain alive, then people will eventually degenerate rather than regain their lost positions. Scientists have determined that among the ancestors of all the tribes that settled on the islands of the Pacific Ocean on the way from Asia to Australia, there were about 70 women capable of childbearing. Accordingly, if a group of people of several hundred people survived, then humanity may have a second chance. It will also be important who these people were before the end of the world. If among them there are a sufficient number of people adapted to work, able to cultivate the land or hunt, then such a group will be able to provide themselves with housing and food. If there are surviving doctors, engineers, or teachers in the group, people will have access to certain technologies. But the main thing is that they should be able to establish a system for transferring this knowledge to future generations. With a high probability, these people will not live in large cities, but will settle in rural areas. At first, they may return to foraging through hunting and gathering. Moreover, at first, the collectors will often visit ruins of dying cities. But gradually, nature will completely absorb and destroy buildings, roads, and bridges. As in ancient times, rivers will become the main trade routes. Along with their shores, the human world will be recreated. When recreating agricultural technologies, humanity will face serious problems. The fact is that most modern plants that are grown on an industrial scale are the result of a long selection and cultivation of the necessary qualities. Without proper fertilizers and proper care, they will either not be able to provide the desired yield or simply die, and people will die after that. Of course, some simple technologies like a windmill or a water wheel can be restored fairly quickly. With minimal knowledge of mechanics and electrical engineering, wind generators can be created and people will be provided with electricity to some extent. But such a familiar thing as an incandescent lamp cannot be assembled without an appropriate level of development of science and technology. After the depletion of all fuel reserves, which also loses quality over time, you will again have to switch to horses. Making even the simplest rubber products on your own will also be very difficult. Synthetic fabrics will disappear. Therefore, after some time, wool will become the main raw material for the production of clothing. Shoes will again be made only of leather, or even return to the use of wooden shoes or bast shoes. The only resource to which people will have practically no problem is metal. Even with constant corrosion and destruction, the supply of metal objects that mankind now uses will far exceed the needs of a handful of surviving people. For its processing, it will not be necessary to develop mines or smelt ore. True, this may adversely affect the preservation of the remnants of knowledge in geology and metallurgy. But knowing the nature of people, another scenario of life after the end of the world is more likely. It is he who underlies most films, books, and computer games. The surviving people will unite in small tribes and will kill each other for the meager remnants of resources. And with each dead person, a piece of knowledge that could help in the restoration of our society will leave the world. Thanks to everyone who watched the video to the end. You can learn more about the possible options and expected dates for the end of the world, as well as other global catastrophes of the past from other materials posted on the Dinosaur Age channel.